This presentation is about the Chinese philosophers at approximately 500 BCE, and it's about Confucius, Laozi, and Shang Yang. So during this time at approximately 500 BCE, there's a lot of problems that are leading up to a major warring state period in China. And what happens is the Zhou dynasty, you might remember, had the mandate of heaven. And that was the belief that if the emperors were authentic, if the emperors were not greedy, if the emperors treated the people in China well, they would have good crops, nobody would go hungry, and there wouldn't be any type of fighting. But the Zhou dynasty was losing the mandate of heaven. And the belief is that people within the Zhou became greedy and they were not sharing any of their profits with their peasants. So you end up with these 7 states, and you can see the picture there on the left, that began to war with each other, and they were all trying to gain control over China. So if you think about it, it's sort of like California's warring with Nevada, and Nevada's warring with Arizona, and Arizona's warring with California, Nevada, and New Mexico, and everybody's warring against Idaho. Eventually what's going to happen is you'll have a lower population. You'll have a population that's dissatisfied with the instability in their regions. You'll probably have lower crop production. You'll have people going hungry, and everybody is really struggling. So if this lasts for about 350 years, they're really desperate for one group to take over. But of course, they want their group to take over. And we know it ends at 221 BCE because that's when the Qin dynasty, the one that's to the farthest left, sort of the pink on your picture, that's when Emperor Qin is able to solidify the warring states and take control over China. So Confucius was around at the time where the warring states broke out. And he actually thought that if people would just listen to him, then they wouldn't go to warfare. But the problem was nobody liked Confucius. Confucius was very arrogant and he was disagreeable, so nobody really wanted to listen to them. He wanted to be in charge of the government, but nobody wanted to work with him. So he actually ended up, you've heard that saying, if you can do, if you can't teach. So Confucius actually became a teacher. And what he believed that if we would just follow the structure of society, and society should be, first, to honor our ancestors, second, to honor the elder members of our family, so like our grandparents, our grandmother, and our grandfather, and then to honor men. So women and children have the lowest rungs in society. But if we followed this structure, and if we all followed this structure, then the people within our families, the eldest members who had the most experience, would be making the decisions and things would be good. Well, this eventually came to the idea that we would put one's government goals above our family members. So whatever was good for the government is what we would need to do and put our own greed and our own desires aside for our family. And this eventually, not at the time of Confucius, but you fast forward about 400 years or so, and this actually became the time where you honor the emperor above everything else. And he actually thought that the way that we should do this is we should study the Analects, and these are really writings of Confucius. So the structure in society should be followed on his writings, and it makes a lot of sense because if you structure society and everybody has their place, and the emperor or the government is in charge of those places, we would just fall into a society where we wouldn't war amongst each other. And especially if we weren't greedy amongst ourselves, so we didn't want additional things. And he thought that people would, fix the warring states. Of course, this idea actually influenced society for approximately 2,500 years. It still influences East Asian philosophy and society, but it didn't fix the problems of the warring states. This is, however, what the Eastern educational system is based on today. It's on structure, it's following the guidance of our parents, and it's a lot of rote memorization. So like the Analects initially were to memorize those, and that's still what happens in East Asian schools. So these ideas come from a person or a group of people, maybe some sages, some very wise men, named Laozi, Laozi or Laozi. So it depends on, where you see it written, but this is all the same person or the same group of people. And this comes about actually before the major warring states. And there's the idea actually that Laozi may have met with Confucius and they spoke together and they agreed on some ideas. But what happens is that this person or these groups of sages come up with the ideas of Taoism or Taoism. So it's the exact same thing. And there are writings that are put together called the Tao Te Ching or the Tao Te Ching, and it's known as the Way. And it's a philosophy and sometimes applied as a religion that pretty much says the yin and the yang, you can't get away from it. So the yin and the yang are the natural forces, and we just need to live with those natural forces and try and stop fighting it. And the more we fight nature, the farther from ourselves we become. And the more we accept the natural forces, the less we fight within ourselves. And if we fight less within ourselves, then we'll have inner peace. And the idea is that if each individual has inner peace, they'll have no reason to fight each other because they'll be happy with themselves, happy with their lives, happy with their jobs and everything, and we'll just accomplish more in that way. So if we stop fighting, if we stop pushing and we allow nature to take its course and stop trying to control things, we'll have more inner peace. And I always think about this kind of like if my dog gets out of the yard. My dog's a Siberian Husky, he likes to run. And the idea is if he gets out of the yard, he comes back in about 10 minutes and he sort of swings back by the house to check on us to see what's happening because he doesn't really want to be gone. But if I go out of the gate and I start calling him and I've got a treat and I'm like, hey, come on, Zeus, get a cookie. He comes up close enough to me to sort of see me and say, hi, here I am, and then he runs off. And if I follow him farther, he goes farther from the house. And if I continue to follow him, it might take an hour or 2 hours for him to come back where I'm fighting it. And the natural course is he's going to come back on his own. And I'm making it worse by chasing him. That's sort of the yin pushing against the yang. By not following the natural forces, we can make things worse. And if we don't follow nature, then we will not be at peace with ourselves. If we're not at peace with ourselves, we can't be at peace with society. And the idea here is sort of like the less you do to control things, the more peace you'll have in your life. So the idea of Confucianism and the idea of Taoism, they didn't fix the warring states, but they both influenced Chinese society and they still influence Chinese society today. But the idea that actually did fix the warring states was the idea by Shang Yang. And what happened is, of course, if you see the time period, he's living, much after Confucius and Laozi. So he has experienced the trauma of the warring states more so than the other two philosophers. And he believed that if people were afraid to commit any crime, then they wouldn't commit big crimes. So think of it like this. Right now, if you're driving to Reno and you're on the 395 and you're speeding, at like 75 miles an hour, the speed limit there is 65. Most people probably speed, they go 72, 75 miles an hour. Most of us aren't going to drive 90 miles an hour, but we're going to push the speed limit at least a little bit, right? So the idea is if you were speeding and you got pulled over by the police, instead of getting a fine or maybe even a warning, you would actually have a major penalty. So it might be something like you might have the death penalty. It might be that they would you'd be sentenced to have your left hand chopped off, and it would be not just you, but everybody in the car, because the other people in the car sort of allowed you to break the law. So very, very harsh punishments for minor crimes. And the idea also is that if somebody in your family or somebody in your neighborhood was committing a crime, so let's say that they were walking their dog and their dog pooped, on the sidewalk and they didn't clean it up, then that actually was a fine that could be punishable by death. And it might not just be your death, but it could be to execute your entire family. Or if they knew that your neighbor saw it, because somebody saw your neighbor watching, they might execute the neighbor as well, because they did not report the crime. So it has the secret police force, and it's the idea of, it turns out to be legalism. So you fight the warring states with legal ideas. And the irony of this, I love this, because Shang Yang actually was executed under his own policies. So what happened is Duke Xiao of Qing, he actually died. And the next person who came in charge was unhappy with Shang Yang because the other person was penalized, and he thought that Shang Yang didn't honor his place in society, and he was penalized like a commoner. So anyway, Shang Yang was then in exile, and he was going to an inn, and he would want to stay, but the innkeeper wouldn't let him stay because Shang Yang didn't have the proper paperwork, and actually turned him over to the authorities, and Shang Yang was executed, and his entire family was executed as well. Though Shang Yang was executed, his ideas still influenced Chinese society, just as Confucianism and Taoism. And the person who was able to solidify the Warring States, it's the first emperor of China, and it's Qing Shi Huangdi, and the D actually means God. So he added God to his title. So he is actually known as the first emperor of China, and he used a combination of all of these ideas. What he did decide, though, is he didn't like Confucianism because many of the scholars actually went against some of his ideas. So he's famous for burning books, and he burnt pretty much all of the books on China except those in fortune telling, medicine, and agriculture. And he also executed scholars, so he's famous for burying a mass burial of burying 431 scholars alive. And then he also sent many other scholars or librarians to work camps where they pretty much died in the mines or died in the fields. He did implement the legalist policies, and he was able to solidify China. Here you see a picture of him, but you also see a picture of the famous terracotta warriors. This is his tomb. So one of the pictures is the terracotta warriors, and the other picture is a life-size chariot pulled by horses.